Good morning from Tilorien Monastery. It's very misty out there, and we see some snow, a little bit of snow on the meadows out there. It's really beautiful, and I'm really happy to be here and start with giving a short introduction about what we are doing today together. So this practice day is going to be from 9 to about 4 o'clock, and we're going to have a break for lunch starting at about 11:15, and then you can also go ahead, and help yourself to some food or whatever you need to do, and then we meet again back here on Zoom at 1 p.m. and we would like to keep this day in noble silence, which means, if anything needs to be spoken about, which is important for organizing the day, also please, by any means, speak. But otherwise, you all have permission to, turn inwards and preserve your energy for your own practice. You don't have to speak to anyone. You don't have to say anything nice. You can just really go inwards for these few hours. It's a very precious opportunity for all of us. And the theme of the day is turning towards any kind of challenge, turning towards any kind of difficult experience. And in particular, I'd like to also speak about the climate crisis, which is becoming more and more apparent, and which is a very difficult truth for many of us to really turn towards and allow that information to come inside ourselves and be digested. And hopefully, we can respond with some kind of contribution. But first, we have to really open to it and allow us to be changed by the facts that we have come to a point of non-return in terms of changing the climate on this planet. And I think that's a very important truth, which we need to make space in our lives so that we can learn from it. And we have the tools with the Buddha Dhamma to learn from any kind of a challenge, not only, small things, but even very huge things such as this. And about the schedule, we're going to have times of reflections, and then there will be guided meditations and walking meditation as well, and time for sharing and question and answers and comments. And a little bit of chanting as well. And before I go any further, I'd like to ask, is there anyone who has no experience in meditation at all? No, so that's easy for us. And is there anyone who doesn't know how to do walking meditation? I asked that as well. No, so you all know that as well. So that's really great. Makes it easier for us. Okay, I think, that's all I'd like to mention in the beginning, and then I would like to start with a traditional chant in Pali, which is inviting the devas, inviting all the benevolent forces of the universe, to come into this space and to come also into this virtual space and, bear witness to our work and, to our wish to really connect with the challenges of our time, so that we may, grow in Dhamma from that, and also that we can find an authentic response so that we can make our contribution and embody what we know through our lives, which I think is the reason, the real reason for practice is to really act on what we know to be true, not to just sit on the cushion and philosophize about the teaching, but really live from that place. Paritavana metang sameta badanta Vicita Citta Paritang Panantu Samantra Chakravale Suatra Gachantu Devata Sadhammang Munirachasa Sunantu Sakamokatang Sage Kame Charupe Girisikaratate Chantalike Vimane Diperate Chagame Daruvanagahane Gehavatumi Kete Umma Jayantu Deva Jalatala Visame Yakaganta Banaka Ditanta Santikeya Munivaravachanam Sadavo Me Sunantu Buddha Dasanakalo Ayang Padanta Dhamma Savanakalo Ayang Padanta Sangha Parirupa Sanakalo Ayang Padanta. You know, if any one of you would like to take the 3 refuges now, if you know how to do that, you can just, chant along with us. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami. I have one in my bag in the office, if you can get that for me. Okay, perfect. So we can just start with a short meditation arriving here in this space. Just a few minutes of landing here at the meeting. We're bringing the body and the mind together. A full body awareness. And then bringing to mind your motivation, your intention, why you have come to join us today, and why you're practicing, why you're meditating. using the body, using the weight of the body as a object to return to, and also the breathing. And this day long is going to support us in seeing ourselves and our world differently. And having the refuge of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha as a support for that seeing differently. And through seeing things differently than usual, highlight, the possible contribution which Buddhism and the Buddha Dhamma, can bring to any kind of challenge, and in particular to the ecological crisis which we are facing. Now, the Buddha has lived over 2,600 years ago in the Iron Age in India, and he was not confronted with an ecological crisis of those dimensions. But from the very beginning, the core of the Buddha's teaching was impermanence, emptiness, and conditioned arising, or mutual conditionality. So that everything is in perpetual change, everything is constantly changing. And therefore we can say, the world isn't really made of things, but it's a constant changing confluence of processes, and our bodies and our minds are part of this constant changing confluence of processes, interacting with each other and influencing each other all the time. And also from the very beginning, the Buddha said, I teach about dukkha and the ending of dukkha. And the word dukkha has been translated in many different ways. A good way for it is, I think, stress, or sense of it's not quite right. And we often experience that individually as a sense of deficiency or a sense of lack. And the word dukkha itself, the Pali word dukkha, consists of two parts. And du is a prefix and means something like bad or ill-fitting. And ka is the axle hole in the center of a wheel. So the meaning is, something like an axle which is ill-fitting into the axle hole, and therefore it's a bumpy ride. And I think that's what the experience of dukkha is, in our lives. There's constantly, things not quite the way we want them to be, because of the constant changingness, and because of the fact that there is not separate things which can be controlled, but it's a confluence of processes which is not in our control. But what we can learn is we can learn to move inside of that constant flux. We can learn to open to it, and we can learn to understand what's a skillful way of living in the midst of change and being that change and responding to it from an open heart and an open mind. And the basis for this experience of dukkha is actually our deluded assumptions that we are separate beings. And that cannot only be applied to our individual delusion, but also a collective delusion, that we as a species or we as a society, we experience ourselves as separate from the planet, separate from the biosphere. We experience ourselves as we would live on the planet, like being on a stage. We are not aware yet, we are not familiar with the truth, that we are actually part of nature. We are not like walking around in nature, but we are part of nature. And the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh said, we are here to overcome the illusion of our separateness. And that's in a way, the summary of what the practice is all about, to overcome this illusion of separateness. And we know from child psychology that babies are not born with a sense of separateness, but that arises, as they grow up and get socialized. They are psychological constructs that we learn through language and through being embedded in social communities. And we learn from others to experience ourselves as others see us. For example, the parents look in our eyes and then they say, hello, Maria, or whatever. And then, yes, I'm that. So that's the conditioning gets handed down to us. And that's, of course, necessary in order to be able to live in community. But from a Buddhist point of view, there's always dukkha, insufficiencies, inbuilt part of that process. Because this, this feeling of being a separate self actually doesn't have a reality, and therefore it feels fundamentally insecure. Therefore it is dukkha, because it's an assumption. It's patterns of cognition and emotional patterns, which have a function in terms of orchestrating, how to live inside of a community or a family or whatever, but it doesn't have a reality, and therefore it feels deeply insecure. And it feels insecure because it is not real. So in this, this feeling of insecurity or feeling of lack, feeling that something isn't quite right with me, something is missing, I'm not good enough. This is those different ways how we interpret that experience of dukkha for ourselves. And then, we have our societies, our families, our different cultures who give us different explanations for this feeling of dukkha, what we can do in order to get away from that. But the only way to really come to terms with it is turning towards it, really opening to it and experience it consciously, and then start to see it's actually a conditioned phenomenon, which has been, created and constructed through our socialization, and it can also be deconstructed. And the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha Dhamma, is a set of teachings, is a toolbox which helps us to deconstruct those patterns, these emotional and cognitive filters which we have been accumulating through our conditioning in this life and maybe other lifetimes. So, and our society, offers us different explanations about what it is, what is missing. And, let's say about 1,000 years ago, when the church was still very powerful, we learned that it is the original sin, that we've inherited from Eve, or Adam and Eve. And if we want to be free from that original sin, we have to practice in a certain way and maybe, pay money and go on pilgrimage and all of those things. And then we're going to come into heaven and be next to the big Father God, and then we're going to be happy ever after. So that story is no longer having a lot of power these days, but the approach is still kind of the same. But what we are learning today is, we're taking it much more personal. We are not taking it just like as a human foible, which can be, done away with if we are practicing in a certain way a religion. But these days, our society offers us different explanations according to consumerist culture and capitalism, which is deeply, interconnected with an exploitation of the planet and a disrespect for nature. And it's different, leg projects which are available these days. And I just want to mention a few. The first one would be, I don't have enough money. And that's why I can't buy all of the things which would fulfill and make me permanently happy. Or I'm not famous enough. Because we have a tendency, to see a lot of celebrities on the screens, and there's a kind of feeling, if I would have that same fame, I would be more safe. I'd be more stable. And then maybe the whole story about romantic love, if I find the right person, then I'd be happy ever after. And that's not, against romantic relationships, but expecting from a single person that kind of fulfillment is very unrealistic. And the next leg project would be, my body isn't good enough. And this is especially for women, we get that a lot, that there's some very unrealistic expectations made, where many of us don't really get close to that. And that can also be a leg project. Or I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time. Always thinking in the future, when I have enough money, when I have enough fame, then I'm gonna arrive, then everything is gonna be fine. But if we start to really look into that rushing into the future, we actually never arrive there. Because the momentum in the mind, the pattern in the mind, it's part of the whole mindset. So when we then arrive in the future, we're again in the present moment, and again, there is that kind of sense of in the future. And so that's a feeling of lack is systemic, and it's part of the thought structure itself. And that really, keeps us away from having a relationship with what's happening in the present moment. There's always like a sense of hurry and a sense of an inability to really be in relationship. And, if we don't have the capacity to be in real relationship with something, we also don't feel a real sense of responsibility, because we are already always in the future. And I think that's what we can notice with the consumerist culture, which always thinks in the future we're going to be fulfilled when we have all of those things, and not really having a relationship to nature, having a relationship to the foundation of our lives in the present moment, and therefore not really having a sense of responsibility, not really recognizing what we are doing to ourselves. So there are those leg projects. They are all symptoms of delusion. And therefore it doesn't really matter, how much money or fame we have. If our basic needs are covered, that's of course very important. And there's many, many people on this planet whose basic needs are not secure. Even in the so-called developed countries, there's food insecurity. But this, feeling that it's never enough, it's a systemic thought construct. And it's like a barrel without a bottom. It's never going to be full. That's what dukkha is all about. This systemic feeling of something is not quite right. And that is not because there is something not quite right, but it comes from the assumption that we are separate entities. And that's the systemic delusion. Because if we just stop breathing for 3 minutes, we'll notice how dependent we are on the biosphere. Not even for 3 minutes can we be without exchange in terms of the breath. So it's a total delusion, even it's so obvious. And and the Buddha Dhamma offers us different tools so we can bring it into our own conscious experience, the fact, that we are not separate. And that's why in the Buddha Dhamma it's so fundamental to dwell in the present moment, in the present experience, to see things as they truly are, but not, observing it, from, somewhere a little bit away from what's really happening, but really bringing it in our own experience. Because, understood experience is productive of wisdom and compassion. And understood experience doesn't mean, reading a book. These are signposts which are very useful and important, but then we have to experience it in our own bodies and minds, how that really works. And this, this is what we call insight. And those insights, they are, removing those cognitive and emotional filters which we project onto our experience. And it's those filters, which are different forms of attachments, which are productive of dukkha. And if those filters are removed through insight, dukkha lessens in relationship to how deeply, we have seen through those filters and burst those filters, and they don't come back. So the Buddha said, I teach dukkha and the end of dukkha, in which is also somehow a leg project, but it's a leg project which eats itself up. Like, when you use a match to light a flame, then, the flame brings a light into a room, even that room was dark for 1,000,000 years. When you light a match, you can suddenly see, and then the fire of that match, the light, eats itself up. And that's, what this practice is all about. In the beginning, we need to learn certain methods and really make an effort to do it. But over time, more and more space is created in our minds and in our hearts. And less method is really needed, because it has, something else takes over in our lives, and that's the Dhamma. So I would like to continue with a guided meditation, with one of those tools which we have received, from the Buddha. And it's a meditation on the elements, which belongs to the first foundation of mindfulness, kaya, body. And there's different meditations in this first foundation of mindfulness: meditation on body parts, meditation on the elements, and meditation on death. And I'm going to guide us through a meditation on the elements, because that's particularly meaningful, I think, in context with clarifying our relationship with this planet, and really deeply seeing we are not separate from the planet. We are not sitting on the planet, but we are part of it. And these teachings of the Buddha, they are prescriptive and not descriptive. They don't tell us, what earth element is, but they give us an inroad into experiencing for ourselves what is earth element, what is water element, what is fire element, what is wind element. And it gives us a different sense of who we really are. And that's exactly what we need to cultivate, this different experience of ourselves, to step outside of those old assumptions. And it shifts our identity, from a personal identity to a more universal identity. And we experience ourselves as part of nature. And that's exactly, I think, the shift which needs to happen. Because if we would experience ourselves as part of nature, how would we actually act then? How would we be, not only as individuals, but as a species? We'd certainly much more be equipped, to live here. So it's just one way, of clarifying our dependence on planet Earth, our deep, deep interconnectedness, and the fact, that we never cut the umbilical cord between the planet and ourselves. Because, as I said before, if we don't breathe for 3 minutes, we're gonna die. If we don't eat for 1 or 2 months, the body is gonna break apart. If we don't drink for 4 or 5 days, the body will break apart, and we can also live only in a certain temperature range. So there's a profound interconnectedness which can be experienced very, very simply if we turn our mind towards that fact. And if we do that, again and again and again, it does have an effect on those cognitive and emotional filters. They get thinned out. And that's exactly, what the aim of the practice is. So, find a posture we, can sustain for about 20-25 minutes. And I'm going to lead you through some body scans now in regard to the elements. And you don't have to strain or feel anything in particular, because you already know. It's just make it conscious. Make it conscious what you already know. And follow my guidance. I'm going to lead you through the different areas of the body. And we're going to try to sense the quality of the different elements in those areas, and just allow the mind and the body to just do their job. You don't need to have a particular experience. Just receiving what emerges. trusting that deeper intelligence. So we are starting with, again, being conscious of sitting on the earth, feeling the gravity. Even, we're in the second floor. The gravity is still operating, of course. And allowing the mind to rest on the body, just as the body rests on the cushion or on the chair. And then pressing your teeth together and feeling the hardness of that. So this direct experience of hardness, structure, stability, that's the quality of earth element. And now we're going to scan through the body, and we just experience that earth element, starting with head, earth element, the bones, the skull bones, including the teeth. The teeth are considered the tips of the bones. Hardness, earth element. Then we come to the neck with the vertebrae, earth element. One shoulder, earth element. Upper arm, earth element. Lower arm, earth element. Hand, earth element. And then the other shoulder, earth element. Upper arm, earth element. Lower arm, earth element. And second hand, earth element. Then we come to the torso with the spine and the rib cage, earth element. Hip area, pelvis, earth element. One upper leg, earth element. Big thigh bone and lower leg, earth element. Foot, earth element. And then the other leg, upper leg, earth element. Lower leg, earth element. Foot, earth element. The whole body is permeated by earth element. Earth element inside the body and earth element outside the body, the mountains and the stones, is exactly the same earth element. There's absolutely no difference. We really can't control earth element. Earth element is empty, empty of a self. Earth element is simply earth element. No matter if it's in the mountains and stones outside or in the body. It's all the same earth element. And if we don't eat and take in earth element for 1 or 2 months, the body cannot live. And within 7 years, all the cells of a body are exchanged with nature around us. So just allowing that to sink in, not through the intellect, but just sinking in through direct experience. And then you're becoming aware again of the gravity and the ground on which we sit. There's also some cohesion there. Otherwise, it would be like quicksand. And that cohesion is the quality of water element. Liquidity, fluidity, wetness. And we can experience that in the bodily liquids, particularly in the mouth. We can feel the wetness of the mouth, wetness of the eyes, the blood which permeates the flesh. The flesh is that which is between the bones and the skin. And we can do a body scan now, paying attention to flesh and starting with the feet. And both feet, flesh and water element. Lower legs, water element. Upper legs, water element. Pelvis and hip area, water element. Hip area, water element. Torso, with all of the organs in there, water element. Hands, water element. Arms, water element. Shoulders, water element. Neck, water element. And head, water element. The whole body is permeated by water element. Water element internally and water element externally in the lakes and the rivers, the oceans and the rain is exactly the same water element. Water element is empty, empty of a self. And if you don't drink, for a few days, 4 or 5 days, 3 days, the body will shut down. It can't function. It is in constant exchange with nature. It is part of nature. It's not separate. And in order to maintain the bodily functions, the water element has to have a certain temperature. If it's too cold, it freezes. If it's too hot, it evaporates. So it needs to have the right temperature. And that takes us to the next element, fire element. Temperature, heat and cold, which we can perceive on the skin, where the skin meets the air around us. We can also feel it under the arm, in the armpits, in the mouth. We can also feel the temperature, maybe on the palms of the hands. So we start on the top of the head, being aware of heat, being aware of fire element. Then we come to the neck, fire element. Shoulders, fire element. Arms, fire element. Hands, fire element. Torso, fire element. With the stomach, where all the digestion happens, it's also fire element. Pelvis, fire element. upper legs, fire element, lower legs, fire element, feet, fire element. The whole body is permeated by fire element internally and fire element externally as the sun. It's exactly the same fire element. Fire element is empty of a self. And we can only exist in a certain temperature range on a continuous basis, about, it's about 4 degrees to about 38, 40 degrees. So there's a dependency on all the elements, a constant exchange. Conditioned arising. And warmth and heat are actually just motion, which brings us to the wind element, which is movement, mobility, vibration, expansion, and pressure. And we can particularly be aware of that through the breathing process. Which is a constant arising and ceasing. And if we don't breathe for about 3 minutes or so, the body will shut down. So through this meditation tool of the elements meditation, the conditionality becomes very clear, our dependence on the environment, the fact actually that we are part of the environment. And just allowing that to sink in. The intellectual understanding of that is just like a signpost, but we need to bring it in our personal experience. In order to be truly liberating. In order to really change us on a deep level so that it also changes our ways of relating, our ways of speaking and acting. The mind is the forerunner of all things. So this kind of meditation, interrupts the belief in inside and outside. That there is really an inside and an outside. We start to see, no, there is no inside and outside. That's only conditioned ways of experiencing, which do have an important function in order to live in society, of course. But there's another side to all of this. There's the conventional experiencing, and then there's the ultimate truth And we need to live with both at the same time. That is the middle way. Not attaching to either extremes of something being or not being, but seeing it's dependently arisen. So that's the four basic elements. And then there's, of course, also space element. We are sitting in space. Limitless space. Connecting with that too, the silence, opening the mind. And giving space to all of those four elements to be what they are. And the mystery of that whole process. And the fact, that we are as a species arriving now at a stage of our evolution on this planet, which has never been like that before. And a lot of uncertainty is there, but there is also some things which we can really use as a grounding. And this kind of meditation, very simple, we can use that as a foundation, to stand on. When we are feeling confused and deeply insecure and not knowing. And realigning ourselves with that which is true and self-evident, an experience we can come back to any moment. When you're standing in the supermarket at the checkout, you can feel earth element under your feet. You can feel earth element as you are touching the shopping cart, the hardness, the structure. You can find some way of coming back to the present moment and what's there. And trusting that from that stepping out, of these deluded patterns, coming back to the simplicity of what's really happening, that the next step will become apparent by not getting lost in the whirlwind of lack projects and stories about the future. which are all coming from fear. Coming from a sense of we want to hold on to something. And then we can hold on to the experience of the elements. It's not deluded. That's just the way it is. Can step out of all of those stories and come back to the simplicity of direct experience. And that's what the Buddha's teaching is all about, to give us different tools so we can step out from those patterns and come back to that which is really happening right now. So I'm going to ring the bell now, and then we have 15 minutes for you, to take care of your bodies or do a little bit of walking meditation. And then we're going to ring the bell again at 10:15. And we see you back here then for another reflection. Okay, so this feeling of lack or deficiency or stress or dukkha, sometimes it's also translated as suffering, is actually the shadow of the assumption that we are separate entities. And this meditation on the elements was just like a personal experience of the fact we are actually not separate entities. But still, it's a very deep, deep conditioning. Even we know, if we don't breathe for 3 minutes, we're going to die. There's still that experience of I'm separate. And that's like the mystery, really, of life, which we really need to penetrate deeply, deeply on an ongoing basis to shift those deeply conditioned patterns, which are result of our conditioning, and again pull us into identification with I'm this or I'm that, and I'm in danger, and all of those things. So through the meditation tools of Buddhism, we learn to disidentify, and we learn to pay attention to particular features of our experience we usually don't pay attention to because we are overwhelmed by the stories we tell ourselves. And those meditation teachings, for example, under the Four Satipatthana, Four Foundations of Mindfulness, help us to step out of that identification with content and to pay attention to structure. Those features of experience which are constantly repeating themselves any moment. All experiences are impermanent. They're constantly changing. They are empty of a separately existing self. And, in order to really break through those filters, we have to bring the mind back, pull the mind out of the stories, pull the mind out of identification with content, and point it towards those particular features. And that's what the meditation teaching is all about, to give us guidance in that way. And as I said earlier, wisdom is experience understood, and compassion as well is experience understood. And it results in non-clinging. It results in letting be, letting go, opening, and allowing the way things are. So the meditations are tools for deconstructing and for forgetting oneself, we can say. And our complex samsaric world, our complex samsaric experience is the result of this deluded view of separation and division, which we experience on two levels. On one level is like individually, I experience myself as separate from you and from nature. And on a collective level, as a society, as a culture, as a species, we experience ourselves as separate from the biosphere. And both of those assumptions are conditioned patterns of thinking. And because they are conditioned, they can be deconstructed. Otherwise, if they would be true, there wouldn't be a way out. But there is a way out. And the Buddha's teaching is one way which works. And as I said earlier, when Thich Nhat Hanh says, we are here to overcome the illusion of our separateness. And if we can really fully acknowledge that this is the reason why we are here, why we are reincarnated on the planet, then it must strike us that this climate crisis is actually a huge mirror, which helps us, to understand what's the issue, what keeps us stuck, and points us to the deeper causes of a fundamental delusion, which is at the bottom of our worldview, this fundamental delusion that we are separate. And to fundamentally not understanding which conditions can bring true well-being and true happiness and can liberate us from dukkha. And according to the Buddha's teaching, as I said before, it's about coming into the present moment, bringing mindfulness, bringing awareness to what's really happening right now, and stepping out of those patterns, stepping out of the stories. So mindfulness and awareness is really the central point of the practice, and then also bringing some joy into our lives by recognizing the good fortune we do have, that we do have a teaching, we are part of a sangha, we do have a direction, we have the refuges. Even in the biggest of storms, in the darkest of nights, at least we know the right direction to go. And that is the fundamental difference. Stepping out of identification and turning the mind towards that which is really happening right now. That opens, a path to freedom and lessens our reactivity and, helps us to respond in ways which are constructive, which are healing, and through that, discover a path which makes sense. Even a lot of the experiences might be very difficult and there's a lot of uncertainty. But if we know the right direction to work with this, that makes all the difference. And that is, bringing awareness to what's happening and not getting lost in identification with what's happening. So there's, nothing we need to willfully change, but we need to pay more attention to what is happening. And from that paying attention and going under the surface, we start to have more space around experience. Because that whole, net of delusion, which is constructed, starts to lighten up through seeing the way things truly are. And the most powerful entrance gate for that is the perception of impermanence. Just simply paying attention to impermanence in the breathing process, or as we before looked into the elements which are constantly exchanged as well. So impermanence, impermanence, impermanence really helps us to see how futile attachment actually is. It can only lead to stress. It can only lead to dukkha. There is no other way. And seeing that, leads to this passion, viraga. Raga is, comes from the word rang, which means to color. And that's like, paying attention to impermanence is like washing out that clinging. By again and again, seeing impermanence as it operates all the time, all around us and inside us. And there is no where to go where impermanence doesn't operate. And seeing that, really clearly paying attention to that, washes away the clinging. And then if the clinging, lessens, we have more capacity to really see the way things truly are. We see that things also end. Nirodha, paying attention to the ending of things. And then through paying attention to the ending of things, seeing the whole spectrum of experience, not only, interested in arisings, in new things, in young things, in fresh things, in lovely things, but also paying attention to the whole spectrum, to the ending of things, the going away of things. Paying attention to the whole spectrum, the whole process. Even, to the fact that this body will end one day, and also this planet, this culture, this civilization, everything is a reason, and because it is a reason, it will also end at one point. When we can really let that come into our systems, we gain. In the beginning, it might be, whoa, it might be kind of meat aversion, but if we constantly come back to it, it will create more space around experience. And then out of that space, a next step can emerge, which is not born from an outmoded mindset, but which comes out of that empty space, which is created through insight, the clearing out the space, taking away some of those emotional and cognitive filters, and listening, to that silence, to the empty knowing. And seeing what emerges, what is an authentic response for us. And this, this sequence I was just speaking about, impermanence, dispassion, ending, and letting go, letting be. That's, the last tetrad of the Anapanasati sequence of 16 steps. That's the classic liberating insight, which is actually quite easy to understand on an intellectual level. Impermanence, letting go of craving, letting passion, washing away of passion, seeing endings, and the result, the mind responds with letting go, because it deeply sees the futility of grasping onto that which is constantly changing. And that's a process we can't force, but in the scriptures it's compared with a hen sitting on her eggs. She doesn't need to do anything much, but just sitting on the eggs and really doing that properly, paying attention. Or it's also compared with a carpenter's adze, which has been used over the years, and he doesn't really know, when did it wear out like this, but it did wear out over time. Or the gradual deepening of the ocean, the different images which give us a feeling how this process works. It's the coming back to those particular features of our experience, which normally don't stand out very much, because we are too addicted, to certain stories which are deeply conditioned, maybe early traumas in our childhood, some cultural stories or whatever. And stepping out of those identifications and paying attention to that which is truly liberating. And that requires training. So, and now we have another 15 minutes, so we can pay attention to impermanence and to that sequence in our own experience by turning your awareness, turning your mindfulness towards the breathing process, if that works for you. And if that doesn't work for you, any other object you like to work with. And settling in. And whenever the mind wanders off into wanting to think about something, wanting to contract around the pattern, find some feet under the ground, so to say, just gently, bring the mind back to present experience, what's really happening, which is body sitting and breathing in and breathing out. And there's some sound. The ventilation system we have on. Yeah, lucky to have that. Can hear the sound of that. It's also permanent. Maybe some thoughts flickering by. Just allowing that flow. Putting down all agendas. And just being the knowing of that flow. Not getting stuck on any of the waves or any of the clouds, but being the ocean, being the sky. And not splitting off the energy into thinking. Making space for the energy in the body, in the mind, to be what it is. Might be unpleasant, might be a sense of uncertainty, just some craving, for something different than what is. And just allowing that to be there, knowing this is impermanent. or some aversion, not wanting something, making space for that to be there, drawing close to that, not needing to change anything, not taking it personal, but allowing it to do its thing, have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that is okay. So building the capacity for being with the way things are, not having to interfere all the time, having this big need for comfort, which is actually destroying the planet and bringing a lot of discomfort. Seeing if we can build capacity to be with dissonance. That's liberating. And it will loosen up expectations and assumptions about how the things have to be. Those leg projects, which don't work or work only to a certain degree. So for the remainder, just sit on your own and paying attention to impermanence. And allowing yourself to be changed by that truth. So in a minute or so, I'm going to ring the bell. Then we have some time for sharing and questions or comments, and then maybe a little bit more time for silent meditation until the lunch break at 11:15.